Now, I'm saying Squid Game 2 is a downgrade in the title, but it's not a massive downgrade, and if anything, I think the way the season turned out is the best possible outcome for season 2. At least in terms of where the story went, because making a satisfactory follow-up seemed like an impossible task. Season 2 simultaneously does enough new, while also staying familiar to the core DNA of the first season. It's definitely not perfect, and there are some big flaws that weigh the season down. One of which I'll just go into right away, and that season 2 is essentially half of a season. It clearly ends at about the midpoint of the narrative arc, and basically nothing is resolved. What makes this feel even weirder is that there's only 7 episodes, so I guess season 3 is going to be like 5 or 6 episodes? Which, at that point, it just seems like Netflix is blatantly cutting the season in half to artificially milk the show for more money. What happened to having 12 or 13 episode seasons? That's not even a foreign concept for Netflix, as some of their past shows used to be that long. The irony of this whole situation is really weird given the capitalist themes in the show, but that's kind of going off topic. Another issue that ties into the ending being abrupt is that all of the subplots have terrible pacing given that we're cutting a 1-season arc in half. Both of the subplots that are established had a pretty big mid-act lull. The main example of this is a minor spoiler, but it's revealed in the very beginning where the detective character survived, which in of itself is very convenient, but I'll allow it as he's a tool that opens an interesting path for the story. For his subplot though, it essentially runs into a brick wall where nothing happens for multiple episodes until the end. And when the Squid Game started, that subplot had me excited because of its implications. But some things didn't go to plan, which is fine. However, that kinda just meant that the pretext of the season being more fresh and original was erased. Then there was another minor subplot behind the scenes that alluded to a future dynamic that never comes back up until the very end of season 2. In the first season, I think the pace was far better and the parallel subplot of the police detective infiltrating behind the scenes was great. That was such an engrossing subplot that simultaneously gave the viewer a lot of information and fleshed out the inner machinations of the games. It was intriguing, mysterious, and was laced with this heart-pounding tension. The VIPs didn't even show up in season 2, which felt odd because they were the primary drivers of evil, and their lust of watching these gladiatorial games play out was disgusting. What takes that background subplot's place in season 2 is flat out underwhelming and borderline hinders the pace at times. These subplots were clearly not written to sustain this season, and intentionally feel like they're dragging their feet until their inevitable payoff in season 3. At least the main plot has a major climax, but I'd argue that subplots also need an equal amount of growth, instead of just disappearing for multiple episodes. To kind of balance out the critiques, I'll pivot over to a positive. For the actual Squid Games, I think the creator comes up with 2 unique twists that energize the games with an ounce of originality. This was by far my biggest concern, that this would all be a retread, which it still kinda feels like that at times, but there are some new things to chew on. One of which is a character that I can't reveal as his identity is a spoiler, so from here on out until I go into spoilers, I'll put Danny Devito's face on him. And he's around quite a bit, so just get used to Danny DeVito randomly popping up in my video. This character is a great new addition and adds a deeper complexity to the dynamics of the games. But moving away from him, another example I'll focus on more heavily is that the contestants now have the ability to vote to leave after each game, and can also keep the added prize money up until that point. To clarify, the death of each contestant adds more money. This naturally leads to some interesting conundrums, and I found the most compelling moments in season 2 were the awkward scenes where 2 friends kind of end up betraying each other by disagreeing about continuing the game. There's a lot of heated dialogue, although some of the debates are pretty silly, especially the fact that in the beginning, the side that wants to continue makes the argument that they have an experienced player with them, so their odds of survival are higher. However, no one made the point that people actually have to die to increase the prize pool. So to even get to a satisfactory payout, the vast majority of them need to be killed. That was kind of annoying that no one really made that point and just generally said that more people will die. But this does introduce a new overall theme of gambling, and particularly the hot hand fallacy, which is the belief that your chances of winning go up after you're on a winning streak. It's that one more mentality that's so intoxicating, and these people are risking not only their own lives, but even the people who don't want to keep playing as well. That kind of base conflict was cool to explore in a show that gave me the impression that it had nothing left to offer. However, there is a minor drawback to having a major vote at the end of each game in that we're now drastically slowing down the Squid Games by adding these extra steps. Instead of going from game to game, we're stopping for long periods of time to vote to continue or not. Sometimes the voting scenes can be really interesting and based in tension, but to me, it started to feel like the 50-50 split was getting a little tropey, and other times the vote felt like an arduous formality. As I said, these scenes are interesting, but it does negatively affect the pace a bit. Another thing is that the creators use this time for extended character development, and it's also kind of hard to judge said characters in Season 2, as we haven't really seen the payoff for their arcs yet. So naturally, I feel like people would enjoy the characters in Season 1 more because they're fundamentally complete. There hasn't been any moments as strongly resonant and heartbreaking as those 1v1 games in Season 1. Maybe that'll happen in Season 3, but at the same time, they achieved that by Episode 6 in Season 1. So those highs haven't been actualized yet, assuming the narrative actually gets to that point. As for the characters, I think most of them are pretty solid and none of them are really bad. I've seen a bit of divisiveness surrounding Thanos, but I really enjoy him and thought having a more mentally unhinged character is great for this setting. Along with him actively taking heavy drugs during the games, so he injects this fun, surreal energy into these darker and morbid activities. Going into another positive before melting back into a negative, I think Season 2 oddly peaks pretty early with its first episode. That's where the season was the most unique, as it was more of an investigative mystery. There was also this massive payoff with this Russian roulette game that really no other game so far has come close to, from the emotional impact, editing, music, and directing. Those scenes were great, and I also really liked the established narrative motif of gambling, where the Squid Game recruiter went up to homeless people offering them bread or a lottery ticket, to which most of them would gamble. The commentary was obviously on the nose, but it cleverly synergizes with the upcoming change in the Squid Games. Although, I'm not sure why this guy was even doing this to begin with, as he wasn't even recruiting anyone for the games here, but whatever. Then going into the actual Squid Games, I think everything besides red light, green light was really fun. Especially the game where 5 people were chained to each other's legs, and they had to round this track circle while each person had to complete a unique minigame. It was exciting and exhilarating, and it's too bad that the first game wasn't also original. It seemed more like they went that way for the sake of nostalgia, and I wouldn't be surprised if Netflix insisted on them returning to that game. It does technically help establish that Seong was in Squid Game before, since he warns everyone, but that could apply to any other game as well. He also tries to help people to strategize, but I mean, like, it's just red light, green light. All you have to do is not move when they call red light and you're fine. So bringing forth a stratagem to a game like that is a little silly, and this new perspective of an experienced player helping the newer players falls flat. I think it's about time to go into some spoilers, and we can finally unmask who Danny Devito is. Danny Devito is actually the front man. Now, on one hand, I think it's a little cheap to copy the planted player plot beat from Season 1, but on the other, I think it changes things quite considerably given that the audience knows that he's a spy from the get-go. It adds a lot of depth to every interaction Frontman has with Seong, as there's a lot of nuance in his performance given there's so much background context influencing the way he acts. He kind of single-handedly makes the season work, and without the frontman playing in these games, I think Season 2 would be far less interesting, and it would be much more of a bland retread. Especially since the tracking chip that Seong takes into the game is removed, which to me was really disappointing, and it still seems like the narrative is going in the direction of the detective finding the island. So it kind of goes back to that point I brought up where the subplot is dragging its feet to its conclusion. Also, in relation to this subplot, the captain turned out to be a mole. This wasn't that surprising because the circumstances of the detective being found by a random fisherman was too good to be true. To be fair, it's still extremely implausible for this guy to survive this fall, but it just didn't make sense for Frontman to not be involved with his brother's survival. So the captain being compromised was a pretty underwhelming reveal, as that was the ending point for the subplot for season 2. Then for the ending, I thought it was a pretty exciting direction, but it kind of falls flat and the status quo of the show by the end isn't actually broken. It just felt like an explosive little detour, and in the grand scheme of things, only one character died. That seems kind of crazy considering how big of a deal this plot point was, and you think more characters would die to solidify the major impact of this point in the story. However, it seems like the characters who survived have more to contribute to the story in Season 3, which is fine, but that in turn kind of hurts Season 2's seemingly grandiose and explosive finale. And to add to this, it kind of felt like this had a marginal impact on the antagonists, as it felt like they had an endless amount of soldiers and they still have more left over after all of this. Also, the action wasn't anything of note as it became really repetitive. The main thing I liked here though was how much emphasis they put on the issue of running out of ammo. So many movies and shows run into this infinite ammo trope, and it was surprising to me how much realism a show like Squid Game brought to this sequence. It would also probably be better if the sequence was a little shorter because it lasting 30 minutes further adds to the repetitiveness. So yeah, that's Squid Game 2. It was alright, although I'm someone who was much more pessimistic about Season 2 going in. If you're excited for Season 2, then you'd probably enjoy it. It's still very well made and genuinely has some great moments to offer, like in that first episode. If Season 2 was actually longer and Netflix was releasing Part 2 in a month, then I feel like quite a few of my criticisms would dissipate, but the fact that it's being packaged as a whole season is kind of laughable. Thank you for watching, and my Letterboxd, Discord, and Patreon links are in the description. Thank you to my top patrons Logan Farmer and Simply Put. You guys are awesome.